Okay, so we're here for part 2 of the midterm overview. And so I left off with part 1 talking about these 3 time periods. And let me just fill in the years for the post-industrial era. And if you recall, I mentioned in the last video that it's important for you to know these. And that's so that you have some context as to when these changes were taking place. And you could even then, once you have that understanding, you should be able to compare and contrast them, look at similarities between different time periods and differences. How did families change, for instance, as far as what people did, how the household changed, how work changed, as well as, along with how work changed, how the economy was changing. Okay, so let's go to this last point, and this is the third major area that you should be familiar with, is social stratification. Social stratification refers to a structured inequality, and inequality meaning how when people or groups are treated differently. Inequality is when inequality is integrated throughout a society. That means that it is structured, meaning that it exists within social institutions within our society. And, for example, so I mentioned it's a structured inequality, and I believe that's how the authors define it. But it exists within social institutions of society. So, for example, it's in education, it's in religion, we see it within government, we see it within the economy, within mass media, within the criminal justice system, within the way that we see the way that our society assumes that families should be structured, so the family structure. So still our society operates upon the assumption that people should have a heterosexual nuclear family. So that's 2 heterosexual parents along with their children. That is a nuclear family. And that is a huge assumption, so that it leaves out many other family forms that exist. And as the title of our textbook states, there's diversity in families. So there are single-parent families, there are grandparents raising children, there are foster families, there are families with adopted children, there are same-sex couples, so many different ways of having family life in our society. So again, social stratification, it's inequality that's in society. If we look at religion, for instance, most religions are patriarchal, meaning they have a male-dominated structure, so males hold authority positions within them. Within government, we see something similar. So even though women are a little over half of the population, women are not represented equitably in government, which means that when there are decisions that are being made in regard to health care, in regard to access to contraception, for instance, those are disproportionately, those tend to be men who are making those decisions. When it comes to discussions about access to ending a pregnancy, for instance, those discussions and decisions are primarily being held by or had by men, and not very many women who are involved in that. Okay, I hope, so those are just a couple examples. I hope that kind of gives you kind of a picture of what social stratification does. So these groups are unequal, and in the chapter refers to race, class, and gender. So we see inequality in regard to these groups. So people by their perceived race, by their social class, and by their sex/gender. And so there are consequences for that. So some groups have privileges as a result of groups that they're a part of, I mentioned males, for instance, patriarchal religion, so males have privileges, and other groups have disadvantages. So we can see how, for instance, women may have disadvantages in some areas. For instance, on average, women earn less money than males do as far as salaries are concerned. And part of the reason is that girls are taught to be nurturing and to seek careers where they can be nurturing, and those careers are not paid well. They don't tend to be paid well. So even if women were entering in those caregiving positions, such as being an elementary school teacher or caring for the elderly, we can still construct a society where those caregiving occupations are paid according to their worth, according to their value. It's very critical to have an influence upon children, to teach children how to behave in society, to educate children. So that should be, if we look at it that way, that should be a higher paid occupation. If we look at giving care to the elderly, for example, in a nursing home, that is an important occupation, and it's sorely needed in our society, and it's rather contradictory that we do not pay those workers very well who are engaged in those occupations, in those nurturing, caregiving occupations. Okay, so briefly, let's look at these three examples. So we see inequality by race. Race is a social construct, meaning that society has kind of made it up. So society has kind of picked out what physical characteristics designate a particular race, and in the United States, typically that's skin color, hair texture, the shape of eyes, nose, and lips. And if we think about what racial groups we have and have had referred to in scientific articles as well as in government, those racial groups tend to be whites, blacks, and the colors have been used for many groups in the past more frequently. Native Americans were referred to as reds, or red people. People who are Asian, have Asian ancestry, were referred to as being yellow people. It sounds rather ridiculous today, but in my mind, it's as ridiculous as referring to people as white and black. Because if we look at people who we call white, if we compare them, we'll find that they have many physical differences. There are people with different skin tones, or people with different hair textures, different eye shape, shape of their noses and their lips, but yet we place them into this same category. And when people immigrated to the United States, for example, from Poland or from Ireland or from Finland, they weren't thinking of themselves as white. They were thinking of their cultural background, which is their ethnicity. It's once they came to the United States that a racial label was placed upon them. So one thing I'd like for you to do in regard to each of these categories, race, class, and gender, is to think about how we've already seen examples of racial inequality, class inequality, gender inequality, and I should say racial and ethnic inequality. So some of the groups that we've studied are not racial groups. For example, Hispanics are not a racial group. Hispanic is a culture referring to people who are either Spanish-speaking or they have ancestors who were Spanish-speaking. So that is a cultural group. And as you might have noticed, people who are in this broad category of Hispanic, they can look any number of ways, and that's because it's a culture. Okay, so that is an ethnic group. So in regard to, and it's called racial control, so I should put this in quotation marks because when we're talking about racial control, we do refer to some groups that technically are not races. But one example of race-ethnic inequality that we've seen in race ethnicity One of the examples that we've seen is racial control from Chapter 3. And some highlights of those examples of racial control from Chapter 3. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, for example, in 1848, the sharecropping system that emerged after slavery, and the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So with each of those, we see how groups, based upon how they were labeled as a particular racial or ethnic minority group, they had their labor extracted from them by dominant group, and they were paid less than people who had European ancestry in the United States. So if you recall from Chapter 3, it was only white men who had the ability to be paid the family wage, and that was the wage that you could earn where you would be able to support your wife and your children at basically a middle class level, so that she would not have to work. So low income families didn't have that option. They weren't paid the family wage. So disproportionately, we saw low-income families being ethnic minorities, but it was due to the way society was structured, not due to their level of intelligence or how hard that they were working, etc. So please review these examples in Chapter 3, and that should give you a greater understanding of inequality by race and ethnicity. In regard to social class, one of the examples that you've read about is the Great Recession. So we see disproportionately people who were lower income, lower middle class, who were negatively affected by the Great Recession, who ended up losing their houses, who ended up living on the streets, in shelters, in cars, in motels, etc. So please review the Great Recession and think about how social class inequality affects families. And all of these, think about how these forms of inequality affects families and family life. In regard to gender, I'm sure you recall our discussion of the cult of domesticity, cult of true womanhood, and those are examples of how we've seen inequality by sex and gender. So sex is biological. Someone is male, female. It refers to hormones, hormonal differences between these two groups, males and females, as well as the part that they play in reproduction. Whereas gender, so I'm going to add sex here, and gender refers to a social construct. Similar to race, it's something that's made up by society. So society says, this is the way that you should behave if you are a male. This is the way that you should behave if you are a female. So when we talk about what is masculine or what is feminine, those are things that are not biological. Those are things that are social, things that we say that men and women should do, such as wearing certain colors or having certain hobbies. So those are examples of gender. So again, review the cult of domesticity, cult of true womanhood. So that's a good example of how we've seen how we've seen sex and gender stratification. So inequality, and having women believe that they should be homemakers essentially pulled them out of the labor force. So there were some women who were working in factories, let's say, during the industrial period, but largely women were kind of buying into this notion that they should be stay-at-home wives, whereas in the agricultural period, they were pretty active. They were laboring pretty diligently to help the family survive, just as children were, just as the husband was. So imagine in the agricultural period, if women had said, no, I'm not supposed to get dirty. I'm supposed to, wear this, attractive dress and my heels and have my hair done and my makeup done. Families wouldn't have survived. Who would have done the heavy labor, as far as doing laundry, for example? So that's about it. So this is your preparation for